My name's Simon Middleton, and I'm just going to tell you in as compressed a version as possible the story of the Shackleton brand, and then I'll tell you the story of what it is and what it means and its scope, and then I'll tell you about how we funded it, and it's partly crowdfunding, but there's a little twist to that. So the principle of the Shackleton brand is that it's authentic to the story of Ernest Shackleton, about whom more in a moment. It's all British made. It's a brand that has at its centre an ethos of manufacturing in Britain and supporting British jobs. So nothing that we manufacture is made in the Far East, for example. All of our clothes, etc., and musical instruments and all the other things are made in Britain, and we will stick to that. It's a core part of what I believe in. It's also a premium lifestyle brand, so it's expensive, deliberately so. But more about that later. Thank you very much. So Ernest Shackleton, this gentleman here, and he's the guy in the hat, the taller guy in the hat. In the other picture was an Antarctic explorer. Exactly 100 years ago, he was trapped on the ice. This photograph on the right-hand side with his right-hand man called Frank Wild. They're standing on floating ice. They're not standing on land. On the endurance expedition in which he attempted and failed to cross the entire continent of the Antarctic and he was trapped on the ice in 1915. This week in 1915, he was a couple of weeks away from his ship sinking, being crushed by the ice, and it took him another 2 years to get his men home. But that story, which I can't bore you with now, was so inspiring to me that we built an entire business around it. It offers a number of things, that story. One is that it offers me, in effect, a ready-made brand. I didn't have to create a brand. I sort of sequestered a brand, as it were. That story of these 28 men on the ice 100 years ago is so compelling once you get into it, and strangely so modern, that it's almost irresistible. And if you think about the trendy young men of our city, and if you go to London you see an awful lot more of them. There are some of them in this room with beards and short undercuts and so on. That's what these guys look like, and it's incredibly on trend. It's 100-year-old high fashion. What we've done in a very short time is create a broad-based brand offering. And just to run through some of these pictures, we make musical instruments. In the top left there, we make beer, we make knitwear. I'm modelling one now, rather handsomely, I like to think. We're about to launch a full range of clothing. We're about to open our first Shackleton Cafe. We're about to begin a series of events called the Shackleton Sessions, acoustic music events, which will roll out across Norfolk next year and possibly nationally after that. We'll have plans to get involved in outdoor gear, camping gear and so on. That picture is quite hard to read. The picture in the middle at the bottom there is chocolate. We're about to launch a range of Shackleton chocolate made in craft-made chocolate made in Norwich. And on the right-hand side at the bottom there's a picture of a Shackleton quilt, which is made of Harris tweed and corduroy. It's a gentleman explorer's quilt. So quilts aren't just for girls, guys. Okay. This is. I'm told by the Telegraph, who did an article about us a little while ago, that we're part of a movement that apparently is known as the lumbersexual movement. It is so much cooler than metrosexual. Lumbersexual is guys with beards but who are in touch with their feminine side. You see a lot of them in Hoxton, and they're coming to Norwich if they're not here already. So a little more detail about some of these things. We opened about a year ago, we opened what in effect is the first banjo factory in Britain for more than 60 years, probably 70 years. The banjo industry died in Britain in the early 1950s, and we decided to restart it. We've sold over 250 very high quality banjos over the last 12 months. They range in price from about £600 up to about £2,500. We're about to introduce one that's about £5,000. And we've shipped them literally all over the world. They've had fantastic reviews. I've created 3 jobs out of that, 2 full-time instrument makers and my own job. So it's based at a place called Helsden Barnes on the outside of Norwich, and we will be adding more people to it as we go forward. Later this year we're going to start making electric guitars, electric basses. We're moving beyond banjos, much like Mumford & Sons, as you will have read. So we also now produce beer, and some of you will have tasted it. I hope you liked it. We produce a range of 6 beers now, all inspired by Shackleton. And If you look at the bottles, they all have stories about different aspects of his adventure. We've only brought 2 with us this evening because the other 4 are stronger and I didn't want anyone to go home drunk. But for example, the one that I've been enjoying is called the Snuggery, which is named after what the men on the Antarctic floes 100 years ago called the building that they made to live in, which was basically taking 2 lifeboats, turning them upside down and propping them up on shingle on Elephant Island on the Antarctic Peninsula. And they called it the Snuggery, so we have a beer called the Snuggery, and each beer has a story. We started by brewing the beer in Norfolk with a small brewer, small craft brewer, and very good it was too. But we had to grow bigger than that. The demand exceeded the reliability of the supply. So we moved to a family craft brewer, a bit bigger, in Essex, in Brentwood, home of Towie, but also home of very good beers, who were looking, the brewery, interesting, this is an interesting just sort of business aside, that brewery was looking for a brand. They make a fantastic product, but they didn't have a brand to work with apart from their own name, and it wasn't terribly exciting, Brentwood Brewery. So they were looking for a powerful brand to leverage, so we've done a licensing deal with them, essentially. And that's about to roll out to about 200 pubs across Norfolk, and then we'll take it next to Essex and then to London. We introduced knitwear as our first clothing product because knitwear is relatively easy to make. If you can find a good knitwear manufacturer and you can design it appropriately, you put wool in at one end of a very expensive Japanese machine and jumpers come out of the other end. So it's much easier than what they call cut or structured clothing. So this product up here, well, it's the same product in all the pictures, is this sweater, which is made in Leicestershire by one of the best contract knitwear manufacturers in the country. It's very premium. It's a single garment. In other words, there's no seams. There's no seam down here, which you get on most knitwear. It's one piece. It's knitted in one piece. Much like fishermen's wives used to knit on 4 knitting needles in coastal villages all around the country, Ganseys and that sort of style. But now it's done by machine. It's been adopted not only by polar people. Our first retailer is this shop. That is actually a shop in the middle picture at the bottom there. It's on the Antarctic Peninsula. It's called the Penguin Post Office. They bought a whole stock of our jumpers to sell to tourists. It's been adopted by the particularly classic motorbike community because it works brilliantly under a leather jacket. It's not too heavy, but it keeps you really warm because of air, where it traps air, and so on. And over on the right-hand side here, there's some of the beginnings of a new range of knitwear. I'm just going to pass these around just because it's kind of fun. You might want to play with them. We're about to introduce, you'll see a picture of a guy called Tom Crean in a few moments, and we're about to introduce a Tom Crean style hat. He was one of Shackleton's men, so just have a feel of that. It's British wool, so it's slightly rougher than the kind of wool we're used to in most clothes shops, but I just think, man up and get used to that. So, and they're becoming really popular. Feel free to try them on. Then we're going to introduce, and we're in the process now, have a meeting at a factory in Birmingham on Monday to make a full range of properly structured clothing, including things like waxed cotton anoraks, a canvas wool-lined jacket, a navy peacoat made of Harris tweed, etc. The thing that links them all is they're all taken from photographs of Shackleton and his men 100 years ago. We're going to make trousers like Shackleton's. We're going to make a fedora hat like Shackleton's. We've already got belts, here's a belt here. These are made in Herefordshire, so it's all British made, as you can see from the logo. We're at the early stages of that. The first Shackleton Cafe opens in May in Norwich, actually in the outskirts of Norwich at Helston Barnes. We're going to run that for a year as a trial, and we're going to learn how to run a cafe with as much locally sourced produce as possible. Selling our beers, we're going to introduce our Shackleton chocolate, which is also made in Norwich, etc. And then once we've established that model, the intention is to bring it first into the city and then to roll it out elsewhere, probably through licensing of some kind. Quite often people say to me, well, this is all very well, but isn't this a bit random? Well, yes, in a traditional business sense it is random. We didn't find in the market, we didn't find a gap in the market. They always say, find a gap in the market and exploit it. We didn't do that. What we found was a story, and we've taken the story out across a broad base. Now, some things might succeed more than others, but the core thing is everything is British made, everything is premium positioned, everything, we believe, embodies the spirit of these incredible men from 100 years ago. Just to tell you who they are, on the far right, wearing the naval cap there, is Shackleton himself, Ernest Shackleton. In the middle is Tom Crean, one of his men, wearing the the hat that there is being beautifully modelled. The hat that our hat is modelled on. And this guy on the left here is a guy called Blackborough, who stowed away on the Endurance. He so badly wanted to go on the expedition with Shackleton that he hid in the ship. And a couple of weeks out from Plymouth, they discovered him. And first Shackleton threatened to throw him overboard. And then he realised he couldn't do that, of course. They couldn't turn back, and there was no helicopters in those days to come and get him. So he said, OK, you can stay on the expedition, but if we run out of food, you're the first one we eat. And Blackborough lived in fear of that for the next 2 years. And the cat there, very famous cat, Mrs. Chippy, who was the carpenter's cat, and they shot her in the end, sadly, but only to stop the dogs tearing it to pieces. This full of great stories. If you don't know anything about Shackleton, you'll love it. One of the things that we had to do in order to take sort of hold of this brand and run with it, because I'm not a Shackleton, is we had to reach out to the Shackleton legacy and heritage. And one of the first people I contacted when I had this notion was this lady here, who's the Honourable Alexandra Shackleton, who is Ernest Shackleton's granddaughter. Her father was a Labour cabinet minister in Harold Wilson's government, a reforming MP, and an explorer in his own right. And she's the sort of key direct descendant of Ernest Shackleton and the keeper of the flame. She's the patron of numerous expeditions. She's president of various societies, writes the forwards in any book about Shackleton, etc. She is now a shareholder in the company. We gave her shares in the company because I wanted her to be part of the story. So it's not crowd approach, it's a kind of very individual approach. I kind of approached her and said, I'd really like to be involved, what do you think? Worrying that she might write a sort of open letter to the Daily Telegraph or something, saying, how dare you? But actually she said, I absolutely love this, I wish someone had done it 20 years ago. And she's now on board, and she's officially our ambassador. She has cards with brand ambassador and so on. We've become very good friends, and a key part of the story for us, because we were co-opting an historical story, if you like. The guy second from right, you may well recognise if you watch TV, is Rufus Hound, who's a comic actor and comedian and panel kind of person. He's also into classic motorbikes, and he was shown a photograph of one of our jumpers by another motorcycle enthusiast, and he said, this is fantastic, I wish I had one of those. So I sent him one in the post, and he's tweeted 3 or 4 photographs of himself wearing this jumper to 1.3 million followers on Twitter. He's incredible. He's almost as popular as Stephen Fry, Rufus Hound. He's been a real, and that is crucial. Twitter has been absolutely critical to us. I'm too old to understand Twitter, but I kind of know its importance. The other 2 guys, either side of him, are contemporary explorers, serious, card-carrying, hardcore polar explorers. They're all wearing our sweaters. And I heard from another one today, an Arctic explorer, the other end of the world, who has fallen in love with our sweaters as well. Another thing that we've done to sort of build the brand is work very hard, not at a local level, although we have had some local media coverage, is to go straight to the nationals. So that's the Times, the Telegraph, the Financial Times, and the Express. That's me protecting a banjo from Angela Rippon on the One show there, because I'd heard her play it once and I didn't want her to play it again. And I don't know if you saw that One show, it was from a show called Best of British, and they did a little interview with me and her, and she sang a song on the banjo. It was just ghastly, but it did us no end of good. And this one in the middle is the Finnish national daily newspaper, who for some reason did a whole page feature, that's only half of it, whole page feature about it, because they love Shackleton. Scandinavians love Shackleton. This bit's a bit boring, but it's just a bit of advice that when you're building a brand fast, which is what we're trying to do, one of the ways to help yourself to it is to get in contact with every single organisation that is involved in promoting business, everything from the UKTI to the Low Carbon Innovation Fund, which is based here at the UEA, to the Manufacturing Advisory Service. All of it just milk those kind of people, and they've been fantastic to us, actually. This is the bit that I wanted to talk in slightly more detail, because you come here to hear about funding. We have a very different trajectory, in a way, from the 30-year vision, which I massively admire. I've got a 5-year vision because I'm old. And so what we're trying to do is something that several people have said to me is impossible, which is to build a premium heritage brand in 5 years. Now, some people have said to me that you can't do that, it takes 75 years, but that's because they forget the internet It took 75 years in the past, but it doesn't take 75 years anymore. We're doing it in 5 years, and therefore we needed serious funding. And therefore I had to accept dilution of personal equity. Quite a lot of people who run small businesses say, oh, you don't want to give away any of your company. You must hold on to it. I don't believe that. I now own about 30% of the business that I started about 18 months ago. I've given away great slugs of it, but in return I've received substantial funding, which is going to make this a major success, as opposed to just something that occupies me and a couple of people. So what we did is combine, I keep knocking this thing, sorry. What we've done is combine the crowdfunding approach, i.e. Kickstarter, and private equity, the traditional angel funding. And I'll tell you a little bit about how that happened. We launched our first Kickstarter campaign in the autumn of 2013, so about a year and a half ago. And that was to raise money for our first project, which was the Banjo. At that time we were called the Great British Banjo Company. We still are technically, but we're kind of rebranding ourselves to Shackleton. We set out to raise £30,000, and I didn't imagine for a moment that we were going to get it. We raised nearly 50 in the end, including over 100, about 120 advance orders for handmade British banjos, which people largely didn't get for 6 to 9 months. The faith that people put into Kickstarter is quite humbling. In total, we got about 250 supporters from literally around the world, some of whom put in, well, I'll give you an example. There's an actor, an American actor called Ed Helms, who was in a series of comedy movies, the Hangover movies. Do you remember the Hangover movies? He was the guy that tattooed his face, I think, in the first one. He's a American comic actor. He's also a banjo nut. He bought 2 of our banjos, one basic one, at the time was about £400, and one expensive one, about £2,000, right? So he owed us about £2,500. He rounded it up to $5,000, just because he could afford to and because he wanted to support us. And in a funny sort of way, although at a smaller scale, probably 100 people paid more than they needed to for the reward we were offering, because they felt like they were part of a story. But the most exciting thing, apart from the building of a community of supporters, was that 7 people came forward out of the 250 odd supporters. 7 people came forward and said, as it happens, I'm quite affluent and I'd like to invest in your company. And as it turned out, once you go through all the processes and everything, 4 of them fell away. And 3 people who backed us on Kickstarter then invested in the company and are now shareholders in the company. So, that was in 2013. In January 2004, actually that's wrong, in the end of 2014 and the beginning of this year, January this year, we did another Kickstarter to raise money for the development of the clothing brand, and we raised another £35,000. And whilst none of those individual supporters came forward to be angels, what it triggered was so much press and media interest in us. All of those national press articles came out of the latest campaign, that we've raised another £280,000 in equity funding because of that. I was at a thing this afternoon with a group called Anglia Capital Group, which is a group of angel investors around East Anglia, and they're looking for things to invest in. And I did a presentation not unlike this, and I'm confident that we will get more. We're aiming to raise £500,000 this time. That's not because we're greedy, it's because I'm on a very fast growth trajectory, and I'm fed up with looking over my shoulder worrying about going bust and not being able to pay my staff. That's the thing that keeps me awake at night, is not whether this business will succeed. I know it's going to succeed. What keeps me awake at night is whether we will run out of money before we succeed, if you know what I mean. And so that's why we raise money. It's not to fill my pockets, it's to make sure we don't run out of money. Because having created jobs, I never want to go back and have to tell the guys I've hired, I'm sorry, I've overshot the mark, I'm going to have to let you go. I'm never going to do that. So that's what it's about. So that's the story really. It's partly crowdfunding, it's partly working the media very hard, it's partly building a community, and it's partly, in our case, it doesn't apply to everyone, but in our case, acknowledging that sometimes you have to sell part of the company, and I'd rather own 30% of a very successful company than 90% of a company that's not going anywhere. Anyway, thank you very much. I'll stop there.